My golden child sister called me a gold digger when I married rich. 10 years later, she begged me for money. My sister Maya was the golden child who could do no wrong. Straight A's, full scholarship to Princeton, our parents' pride and joy. I was the disappointment, C student, community college, the daughter they kicked out at 18 for wasting my potential. They gave Maya eggs and bacon for breakfast while I got stale bread. She went on field trips to ride horses while I was locked in my room to study. Every wall had photos of Maya's achievements while my participation trophies went in the trash. When they kicked me out, Maya laughed and said I'd end up married to some loser, popping out kids, living off food stamps. But at community college, I met James. He'd built a successful tech company at 19 and was just getting a degree to please his parents. He asked me to tutor him, not because I was smart, but because I explained things simply. We fell in love. When he proposed with a 2-carat diamond, I was terrified to tell my family. I drove home, showed them the ring, mentioned James's business. Maya took one look and burst out laughing. "Gold digger!" she shrieked. "You couldn't succeed on your own, so you're spreading your legs for money. Pathetic." My parents nodded approvingly. "At least Maya will make her own fortune instead of stealing someone else's," my mother said. I ran out crying, convinced I was using James. He held me while I sobbed, assured me I wasn't a gold digger, that he loved me. We got married without inviting them. 10 years passed. James's company went public. We had 2 beautiful kids, lived in a gorgeous house, traveled the world. I hadn't spoken to my family once until my phone rang last week. Maya. "Hey sis, how's the trophy wife life?" I almost hung up, but curiosity won. "What do you want, Maya?" Her voice changed, suddenly desperate. "I need money, just a small loan, like 50,000. I laughed. "You called me a gold digger and now you want my husband's money?" "Look, I know what I said was harsh, but you are a gold digger. That's literally your husband's money, not yours. So stop being petty and help your sister." The audacity floored me. "Maya, you have a Princeton degree. What happened?" She went quiet, then admitted she'd been fired from her 3rd job for embezzlement. No one would hire her. She was living in her car. My parents had disowned her when the scandal went public, apparently. Having a criminal daughter was worse than having a stupid one. "Please," she begged. "You live in luxury. 50,000 is nothing to you." I told her I'd think about it and hung up, but I wasn't going to let this go. I had my own money. James gave me generous monthly allowances that I'd saved for years. I had over $200,000 in my personal account. I could easily help Maya, but she needed to learn a lesson. I sent her a check for 1 cent with a note. "Here's what gold diggers like me can afford to share." She called immediately, screaming, "You bitter bitch. You're really going to let me starve because of something I said 10 years ago? You just called me a gold digger again 5 minutes ago. Because you are one. Then you don't need my gold digging money. Bootstrap yourself up, Princeton grad." She hung up. I thought that was the end. 3 days later, she showed up at my house. Not alone, with our parents. All 3 looked desperate, their clothes worn, their car a beaten-up Honda from the 90s. "We need to talk," my father said. They'd lost everything in a Ponzi scheme. Their retirement, savings, the house gone. They'd been living with Maya in her car for 2 weeks. They needed $500,000 to avoid bankruptcy and pay for a cheap apartment. "You owe us," my mother said. "We raised you, fed you, housed you for 18 years. You gave me bread while Maya got full meals. You kicked me out for getting into community college. Because you were a disappointment. But now you can finally be useful. Your husband won't even notice $500,000 missing." I laughed. "James knows every penny, and he'd never give you anything after how you treated me." Maya stepped forward. "Then divorce him and take half. Give us the money from the settlement." I stared at her. "You want me to destroy my marriage to pay for your mistakes?" "You never loved him anyway. You married him for money. At least this way, your gold digging helps your real family." I was about to throw them out when James walked in. He'd heard everything from his office. "Get out of our house," he said quietly. "Now." My father puffed up. "You can't." "I can, and I will. Leave before I call the police." They scrambled toward the door, but Maya turned back. "You'll regret this. We're blood. We're your family." "No," I said. "You're strangers who happen to share my DNA." They left, but Maya shouted through the door, "Check your mail tomorrow. You'll see who really owns this house." The next day, an envelope arrived. Legal documents. My stomach dropped as I read them. The header read, "Claim of financial elder abuse and demand for restitution." My hands shook as I scanned the pages, each word worse than the last. They were claiming I abused them by refusing help in their time of need. They wanted $500,000 plus damages for emotional distress and abandonment. I read it twice, then a third time, hoping I'd misunderstood. But no, there it was in legal language. My parents were suing me for not giving them money. James appeared behind me and read over my shoulder. He grabbed his phone and dialed before I could even process what was happening. I heard him talking to Tyler, his business attorney, explaining we needed him to look at something urgent. Tyler said he'd come right over. I sat frozen at the kitchen table staring at the papers. Could this actually work? Could they twist my refusal into some kind of abuse? I'd never heard of anyone getting sued for not helping their parents, but the legal jargon made it sound almost legitimate. My stomach twisted into knots as I waited for Tyler to arrive. Within 40 minutes, Tyler walked through our front door carrying his briefcase. He sat down at the table and spread the documents out, reading carefully while James and I watched. He took his time, making notes, flipping back and forth between pages. The silence felt heavy. Every few minutes, he'd shake his head slightly or tap his pen against the paper. Finally, after what felt like forever, he looked up at us. His expression was angry in a way I'd never seen from him before. Tyler explained that the claim was completely worthless. Adult children have zero legal obligation to financially support their parents. Refusing to give money isn't abuse, not even close. This was pure intimidation, an attempt to scare us into settling. He said these kinds of lawsuits pop up sometimes when desperate people hire cheap lawyers who'll file anything. But then his expression got serious. He warned us that even though the lawsuit was garbage, we still had to respond properly. Ignoring it could cause problems down the line. We needed a specialist, someone who dealt with family law and toxic dynamics. He knew just the person. Her name was Harmony Evans, and she handled cases exactly like this one. I called Harmony's office as soon as Tyler left. Her assistant scheduled me for first thing the following morning. That night, I barely slept, going over everything in my head. I gathered all my documentation. The recording of Maya's phone call where she called me a gold digger. Photos I'd taken of them at our door looking desperate. Notes I'd written down right after they left, capturing exactly what they'd said. I even dug up old photos from childhood, the ones showing Maya's achievements covering every wall while my stuff went in the trash. Harmony's office was downtown in a tall glass building. I rode the elevator to the 12th floor, clutching my folder of documents. The receptionist led me to a conference room where Harmony was waiting. She was younger than I expected, maybe late 30s, with sharp eyes that seemed to see right through people. I sat down and started explaining everything. She listened without interrupting, taking notes on a yellow legal pad. When I described the different breakfasts, the locked room, being kicked out at 18, her pen paused. When I mentioned Maya's gold digger comments and their suggestion I divorce James for settlement money, her expression hardened. Harmony explained what she thought was happening. My parents were desperate and willing to try anything. This lawsuit was their pressure tactic. They hoped I'd pay them to make it go away rather than deal with the hassle and embarrassment of fighting it. She'd seen this exact pattern before with families who scapegoated one child. That child grows up, becomes successful, and suddenly the family who treated them like garbage expects rescue. When rescue doesn't come, they try legal threats. She said we had options, but first we needed to know the truth about their financial situation. Were they really broke? Or were they hiding assets while pretending to be destitute? We decided to hire a private investigator. Harmony knew someone good, a former forensic accountant named Nathaniel Santos, who specialized in tracking hidden money. She'd call him today and get him started on my parents' finances. We needed to verify the Ponzi scheme story, check if they really lost everything, see what assets they actually had. Meanwhile, she'd start drafting our response to the lawsuit. I felt guilty about spending money on investigators and lawyers for something this stupid. James squeezed my hand and said this wasn't stupid. This was protecting our family from people trying to manipulate us. We had to do it right. 3 days crawled by while Nathaniel dug into my parents' financial records. Harmony kept me updated on the legal response she was preparing. I tried to focus on normal life, taking care of the kids, but my mind kept wandering back to the lawsuit. What if they found some loophole? What if refusing to help your parents actually was illegal somehow? Then Nathaniel called Harmony and asked us both to come to her office. He had findings to share. We sat in the same conference room while Nathaniel pulled up spreadsheets on his laptop. The Ponzi scheme was real, he confirmed. My parents had invested $80,000 and lost it all when the scheme collapsed. But that was it. Just $80,000. They'd claimed they lost everything, their entire retirement, all their savings, the house. Complete lies. They still owned their house free and clear, worth about $400,000 in the current market. They had retirement accounts totaling another $350,000 that they hadn't touched. They had savings accounts with $45,000. They weren't destitute. They weren't even close to broke. They'd lost money, sure, but they had plenty left. They were just unwilling to use their own assets and wanted to squeeze me instead. Then Nathaniel dropped the bigger bomb about Maya. Her embezzlement case was worse than she'd admitted. She hadn't just been fired. She'd stolen $200,000 from her employer over 2 years, feeding a gambling addiction nobody knew about. She'd been caught when an audit flagged irregular transactions. The company had her dead to rights with evidence. She'd faced serious prison time, but her lawyer cut a deal. She'd pay back every penny on a strict schedule and accept permanent probation. If she missed a single payment or got in any trouble, she'd go straight to jail. That's why she was desperate for money. Not just to survive, but to keep herself out of prison. I stared at Nathaniel's report while Harmony started pulling up legal templates on her laptop. She worked fast, typing sections of our response while explaining what she was doing. The document took shape over the next hour, a formal legal response that tore apart every claim my parents made. She included copies of Nathaniel's findings showing their actual assets and Maya's real criminal situation. Then she added something that made my stomach hurt. She attached copies of old report cards showing the different treatment Maya and I got, medical records from when I'd shown up at the school nurse with bruises from being locked in my room, even my old guidance counselor's notes about suspected neglect. I didn't know those records still existed. Harmony said she'd requested them from my old school district as part of building our case. Seeing it all written down in official documents made it feel more real than my own memories did. The response ended with a clear threat to countersue for harassment, abuse of process, and intentional infliction of emotional distress if they didn't withdraw their claim. Harmony printed it out and slid it across the table for me to review. James read it over my shoulder, his hand tight on mine. Everything in the document was true, but seeing my childhood laid out like evidence in a court case made me feel exposed and small again. Harmony watched me carefully and asked if I wanted to file it immediately or if I needed time to think. That's when she suggested something I hadn't considered. She said we could offer them one chance to withdraw the lawsuit and sit down for mediation instead. She thought they might back down once they saw how much evidence we had and realized we were serious about countersuing. It would give them a way out without completely destroying them in court. I stared at the papers spread across the conference table and felt torn in half. Part of me wanted to crush them, to file this response and watch their stupid lawsuit fall apart. They deserved consequences for everything they'd done, not just recently, but my entire childhood. Maya had laughed when they kicked me out. My mother had called me a disappointment to my face. My father had agreed I owed them for 18 years of feeding me bread while Maya got real meals. But another part of me kept remembering they were still my parents, however terrible they'd been. They'd raised me, even if they'd done it badly. They were old now and broke and desperate. Did I really want to be the person who kicked them while they were down, even if they'd kicked me first? I told Harmony I needed to think about it and took the documents home. That night, James and I stayed up past midnight talking in our bedroom while the kids slept down the hall. He sat on the edge of our bed while I paced back and forth, trying to figure out what felt right. He listened to me go in circles for over an hour before he finally spoke up. He said he'd support whatever I decided, but he wanted me to think about one thing. Someday our kids would be old enough to ask about my family. They'd want to know why they didn't have grandparents or an aunt on my side. I'd have to explain what happened and why I made the choices I made. That thought stopped me in my tracks. I sat down next to him and tried to imagine that conversation. What would I tell them? That their grandparents treated me badly so I refused to help when they needed it? Or that I tried to help but they wouldn't stop being awful? The second option felt better, more like something I could defend to my kids when they were grown. James squeezed my hand and said I wasn't the same scared 18-year-old they'd kicked out. I was a grown woman with my own family and my own money and my own power. I got to decide what happened next, and whatever I chose would be the right choice because it was mine to make. The next morning, I called Harmony and told her I wanted to offer mediation. One conversation where they could explain themselves and I could set clear boundaries about what help I might be willing to give. If they refused or kept trying to manipulate me, we'd file the full response and countersuit. If they came to mediation in good faith, maybe we could work something out that didn't involve courts and lawyers. Harmony said she'd draft a formal letter laying out everything we knew about their financial situation and explaining that their lawsuit had no legal basis. She'd include the offer of mediation and give them 1 week to respond before we filed the countersuit. I agreed and spent the rest of the day trying to focus on normal life while my stomach stayed twisted in knots. 3 days went by with no word from my family. I kept checking my phone, wondering if they'd call or if Harmony would hear from their cheap lawyer. Nothing. Then on the 4th day, my phone rang with Maya's number. I almost didn't answer, but curiosity won again. Maya started screaming before I could even say hello. She called me every name she could think of, saying I'd had them investigated like they were criminals, that I'd invaded their privacy and humiliated them. Her voice was raw and desperate and furious all at once. I stayed calm and kept my voice level. I told her they'd made themselves criminals by filing a fake lawsuit based on lies. I said if she had concerns about the investigation, she could speak to my attorney. Then I told her the offer stood for one more day. They could come to mediation and have an honest conversation, or they could deal with our countersuit. Her choice. She hung up on me without answering. I sat on my couch staring at my phone and feeling weirdly calm. The old me would have been shaking and crying after a call like that. The new me just felt tired and done with their drama. 2 hours later, my phone rang again. My mother this time. I answered and heard her crying immediately. She said she was so sorry, that she'd never wanted any of this, that my father and Maya had pushed her into the lawsuit. She claimed she'd always loved me, that she'd tried her best as a mother, that she knew she'd made mistakes, but she'd done what she thought was right at the time. I listened to her sob and felt absolutely nothing. I'd heard this act before, back when I was younger and more willing to believe her tears meant something real. Now I recognized it for what it was, another manipulation tactic. She wanted me to feel sorry for her so I'd give them money without all the legal trouble. I interrupted her crying and told her if she was truly sorry, she'd convince my father and Maya to withdraw the lawsuit and come to mediation. Otherwise, her tears were just more manipulation, and I was done being manipulated by this family. She went quiet for a few seconds, then started crying harder and saying I'd turned cold and mean. I told her I'd turned strong and hung up. The deadline Harmony had given them came and went with no formal response. No call from their lawyer, no letter withdrawing the lawsuit, nothing. I called Harmony and told her to file the countersuit. She said she'd have it ready by the end of day and would file it with the court first thing tomorrow morning. That night I barely slept, wondering if I was doing the right thing or if I should have given them more time. James held me and reminded me that I'd given them a clear choice and a reasonable deadline. They'd chosen not to respond. That was on them, not me. The next afternoon, Harmony called to confirm she'd filed the countersuit. We were officially suing my parents and Maya for harassment, abuse of process, and intentional infliction of emotional distress. We were asking the court to make them pay our attorney fees and to impose sanctions for filing a claim they knew was fake. Harmony said it would take a few days for them to be served with the papers. Then they'd have to respond or find a new lawyer willing to take their case. I thanked her and hung up and felt a strange mix of relief and guilt wash over me. I'd actually done it. I'd sued my own family. The next morning, Harmony called to tell me their lawyer had officially withdrawn from the case. She sounded almost amused when she explained that he'd filed paperwork citing irreconcilable differences with his clients and professional concerns about the case merit. I asked what that meant, and she said it was lawyer speak, for realizing he'd taken on garbage clients with a garbage case and wanting to protect his reputation before things got worse. She'd already gotten a copy of the withdrawal notice and said we should expect radio silence for a few days while they scrambled to find someone else willing to represent them. I thanked her and hung up feeling oddly numb about the whole thing. Part of me had expected them to fight harder, or at least put up more resistance before their lawyer bailed. 2 days later, I was working at my desk when the doorbell camera on my phone lit up with motion. I glanced at the screen and saw Maya standing on my front porch looking worse than I'd ever seen her. She'd lost weight since their last visit, her cheeks hollow and her clothes hanging loose on her frame. Her hair looked greasy and unwashed, pulled back in a messy ponytail, and the same outfit she'd worn before now had visible stains on the collar. She pressed the doorbell again and leaned close to the camera. I grabbed my phone and opened the two-way audio before she could ring a third time. She jumped slightly when my voice came through the speaker asking what she wanted. Her face crumpled and she started talking fast, words tumbling over each other about how they couldn't afford to defend the countersuit, how they had no money for another lawyer, how they were living in her car and running out of options. She said she was begging me to drop the countersuit, that she knew she'd messed up, but they literally couldn't survive this legal battle. I watched her through the camera and felt that familiar guilt trying to claw its way up my throat. She looked genuinely desperate, genuinely broken, and some part of me still remembered being kids together before everything got complicated. I took a breath and told her through the speaker that I'd drop the countersuit under one condition. She perked up immediately, nodding before I even finished speaking. I said they needed to withdraw their fake lawsuit completely, and all three of them had to come to mediation to have an honest conversation about everything. Maya's face fell and she shook her head, saying that wouldn't work. I asked why not, and she said my father refused, that he was still calling me an ungrateful bitch who owed them for raising me. She said he'd rather live in the car than sit down and talk to me like I deserved any kind of explanation or apology. I felt something shift in my chest when she said that, like a weight I'd been carrying suddenly felt lighter. I told Maya the offer stood and she could take it or leave it. Then I ended the call and watched through the camera as she stood there for another minute before walking back to that old car parked at the curb. She sat in the driver's seat with her head against the steering wheel for a long time before finally driving away. I called Harmony and told her about the conversation, and she said my father's continued anger was actually helpful evidence. It proved this wasn't about genuine desperation or remorse, but about entitlement and their fundamental belief that I existed to serve them and Maya. She said that perspective would help me feel less guilty, and she was right. Knowing my father still thought I was the problem even after everything made it easier to stand firm on my boundaries. 3 days later, Harmony called with news that a different lawyer had contacted her office. She said this one sounded more competent than the last, like someone who'd actually practiced family law before and knew how to read a case file. He'd asked if we were serious about the mediation offer and said he'd advised his clients to accept it as their only reasonable option, given how badly positioned they were legally. Harmony asked if I still wanted to go through with mediation, and I said yes, that I needed to face them and say my piece even if nothing changed. We scheduled it for 2 weeks out to give everyone time to prepare. Harmony said she'd coach me on staying calm, setting clear boundaries, and not getting drawn into their emotional manipulation or guilt trips. She warned me that my mother would probably cry, my father would probably get angry, and Maya would probably try to make me feel responsible for their situation. I needed to be ready for all of that without letting it derail what I wanted to say. After hanging up with Harmony, I sat at my kitchen table and realized I needed more help than just legal coaching. I needed to process why I still felt guilty after everything they'd done, why some part of me still wanted their approval even though I knew it was toxic. I asked James if he knew any good therapists, and he gave me the name of someone his company's benefits covered. Her name was Reagan, and she had an opening the next week. I met Reagan in her office downtown, a small comfortable space with soft lighting and plants on every surface. She asked me to tell her why I'd come, and I started talking about my family and couldn't stop for 40 minutes. She listened without interrupting, taking occasional notes, and when I finally ran out of words, she said something that made me want to cry. She said my guilt wasn't rational, that it was a programmed response from years of being told I was the problem. She said children who grow up being blamed for everything learn to take responsibility for things that aren't their fault, and that pattern doesn't just disappear when you become an adult. Over the next few sessions, Reagan helped me work on specific statements I could use in mediation. We practiced setting clear boundaries, naming specific examples of mistreatment, and offering realistic help that wouldn't enable their dysfunction or put my own family at risk. She had me write down memories of times they'd treated me badly and read them out loud until I could do it without crying. She said I needed to remember those moments when they tried to guilt me into forgetting. Around the same time, James's business partner reached out to me directly. His name was Corey, and I'd met him at company events but never talked to him much beyond small talk. He called one evening and said James had mentioned what I was going through with my family. He asked if I'd be willing to meet for coffee because he'd dealt with something similar and thought his experience might help. We met at a cafe near his office, and he told me about his own toxic family, how they'd treated him like garbage growing up, and then expected him to support them financially once he became successful. He'd set boundaries, cut contact, and dealt with years of guilt, before finally accepting that protecting himself and his kids wasn't selfish, but necessary. He said watching me go through the same thing reminded him how hard it was to stand firm when everyone told you family was supposed to matter more than anything. His perspective helped more than I expected because he understood the specific guilt of having resources while family members struggled, even when those family members had caused their own problems. The night before mediation, I barely slept. I kept running through every possible scenario in my head, imagining what they'd say and how I'd respond. I practiced my statements from therapy, rehearsed my boundaries, and tried to prepare for whatever emotional manipulation they'd throw at me. Around 3 a.m, James found me sitting in the living room staring at nothing. He sat down next to me and pulled me against his chest, his arms warm and solid around me. He said I wasn't the scared 18-year-old they'd kicked out anymore. I was a grown woman with my own family and resources, and I got to decide what happened next. He said no matter what I chose to do in that mediation room, he'd support me completely. I fell asleep there on the couch with his arms around me and woke up feeling more ready to face them than I'd felt in weeks. The mediator's office sat on the 3rd floor of a gray building downtown, and James held my hand in the elevator as we rode up together. My stomach twisted tighter with each floor we passed. The doors opened into a narrow hallway with beige carpet and fluorescent lights that buzzed overhead. Harmony walked ahead of us, her heels clicking against the floor, her leather briefcase swinging at her side. She'd already explained that she'd be present but wouldn't speak unless I needed her to step in. This was my chance to face them on my own terms, with professional support backing me up. We reached the door marked Mediation Services, and Harmony pushed it open. The waiting area was small, just a few chairs and a water cooler, and my family was already there. Maya sat hunched in the corner chair, her arms wrapped around herself, staring at the floor. She'd lost even more weight since I'd last seen her, her cheeks hollow, her clothes hanging loose on her frame. My mother perched on the edge of another chair, twisting a tissue in her hands, her eyes red and puffy. My father sat across from them with his arms crossed over his chest, his face set in that familiar expression of barely contained anger that used to make me hide in my room as a kid. None of them looked up when we walked in. The silence stretched between us, thick and uncomfortable, broken only by the hum of the water cooler and the muffled sounds of traffic from the street below. James squeezed my hand once before letting go, and I felt the loss of his warmth immediately. A door opened and a woman emerged, maybe 50 years old, with short gray hair and glasses on a chain around her neck. She introduced herself as the mediator and gestured for all of us to follow her into a conference room. The room was plain, just a long table with chairs around it and a whiteboard on one wall. She directed us to sit on opposite sides of the table. James and I took seats next to Harmony on one side while my parents and Maya settled across from us. My father's glare burned into me as I sat down, but I forced myself to look at him directly, instead of dropping my eyes like I would have done years ago. The mediator took her seat at the head of the table and opened a folder in front of her. She explained that this was a voluntary process designed to help families communicate and find solutions to their conflicts. Each person would have an opportunity to speak without interruption, and then we'd work together to identify common ground and possible outcomes. Her voice was calm and professional, the kind of tone that probably worked well with most families but felt surreal in the context of mine. My father's chair scraped against the floor as he shifted forward. He cut her off mid-sentence, his voice loud in the small room. "This whole thing was bullshit," he said, and we all knew what the solution was. I just needed to stop being stubborn and give them the money they needed. The mediator's expression didn't change, but her voice took on a firmer edge when she responded. She told my father that interruptions would end the session immediately, and if he couldn't participate respectfully and follow the rules, he would need to leave. My father's face flushed red and his mouth opened like he was about to argue, but then he seemed to realize she meant it. He sat back in his chair with a grunt, his arms crossing over his chest again, his jaw clenched so tight I could see the muscles working. Maya still wouldn't look at me, just picked at her fingernails with intense focus. My mother dabbed at her eyes with the tissue, making small sniffling sounds. The mediator turned to me and asked if I was ready to speak first. My hands shook as I pulled out the notes Reagan and I had prepared, the paper crinkling in my fingers. I started reading, my voice quiet at first but growing steadier as I went. I described specific memories from childhood, the kind of details that were burned into my brain even though I'd tried to forget them for years. How they gave Maya eggs and bacon every morning while I got stale bread and sometimes not even that. How Maya went on the school field trips to ride horses and visit museums while they locked me in my room to study, claiming I needed more discipline because I wasn't as smart as my sister. How every wall in our house displayed Maya's achievements, her report cards and certificates and trophies, while my participation ribbons went straight into the trash. How they told me I was wasting my potential when I got into community college. How they kicked me out at 18 with nothing but a garbage bag of clothes and $200. My voice cracked when I got to that part, but I kept reading. I described Maya laughing at me, telling me I'd end up married to some loser and living off food stamps. I described how they'd approved when she called me a gold digger, how my mother had said at least Maya would make her own fortune instead of stealing someone else's. How I'd run out of their house crying, convinced I was a terrible person for falling in love with James. I looked up from my notes and met my mother's eyes across the table. I told them about the 10 years of peace I'd had without their toxicity in my life. How I'd built a family with James, how we'd raised 2 beautiful kids who would never know what it felt like to be treated as less than their sibling. How their recent behavior, showing up at my house demanding money and then filing that ridiculous lawsuit, had proved that nothing had changed. They still saw me as a disappointment who only existed to serve them and Maya. My mother's mouth opened like she wanted to interrupt, words forming on her lips, but the mediator held up one hand and shook her head. Maya's fingernails were bleeding now from how hard she'd been picking at them, little spots of red on her cuticles. My father's face had gone from red to almost purple, a vein throbbing in his temple, but he stayed quiet. I could see how much effort it took him to keep his mouth shut, his whole body rigid with the strain of it. I finished reading my notes and set the paper down on the table, my hands still trembling but my voice steady. The mediator thanked me and made a note in her folder. She turned to my mother and asked if she was ready to speak. My mother immediately burst into fresh tears, her whole body shaking with sobs that seemed too dramatic to be completely real. She said through her crying that she'd done her best as a mother, that raising 2 daughters had been hard and she'd made mistakes, but she'd always tried to do what was right. They'd been harder on me because they thought I needed more discipline, she said, because Maya was naturally gifted, and I needed more structure to reach my potential. She insisted they'd loved us equally, just showed it in different ways, and she was sorry if I'd misunderstood their intentions. The mediator's expression remained neutral, but I saw skepticism in her eyes, the way she glanced at her notes and then back at my mother. Even a stranger could see through the excuses. My mother kept crying, kept talking about how difficult everything had been for them, how they'd lost everything in the Ponzi scheme and needed help from family. She made it sound like their financial crisis was somehow my fault for not preventing it, like I should have been there to protect them from their own bad decisions. The mediator nodded and turned to Maya, asking if she wanted to add anything. Maya finally looked up from her bleeding fingernails, her eyes meeting mine for the first time since we'd entered the room. To my surprise, she actually acknowledged some of what she'd done. She admitted she'd been cruel about James, that calling me a gold digger had been wrong. She said she'd been jealous of my happiness when her own life was falling apart after the embezzlement scandal. But even as she admitted these things, she framed them as understandable given her stress, given how hard everything had been for her. It wasn't really an apology, just an explanation that somehow made her behavior seem justified. She said she'd been under so much pressure, facing criminal charges and losing everything, and seeing me living in luxury had made her angry. Like my happiness was somehow an insult to her suffering. She didn't seem to understand that she'd created her own problems by stealing from her employer, that her gambling addiction and her choices had led to her current situation. The mediator made more notes, her pen scratching across the paper. My father's turn came and he refused to apologize for anything at all. He said he'd raised me with a roof over my head and food in my stomach, and I was being dramatic about normal parenting. Lots of parents were stricter with one kid than another, he said, and that didn't make it abuse. He'd worked hard to provide for his family, and I should be grateful instead of complaining about getting bread instead of bacon. He said I owed them for 18 years of care, that children had a responsibility to help their parents in times of need, and refusing to give them money now was selfish and cruel. His voice got louder as he talked, his anger building with each word, but he managed to keep it just below the level that would get him kicked out. He pointed his finger at me across the table and said I'd always been ungrateful, always acted like the victim when really I was just lazy and unwilling to work as hard as Maya. The mediator let him finish and then asked him firmly to lower his voice and stop pointing. He sat back with a huff, his arms crossing again, but I could see the satisfaction in his eyes. He thought he'd made his point, thought he'd put me in my place like he used to when I was a kid. The mediator looked at each of us in turn and asked what outcome we wanted from this mediation. My parents and Maya answered almost in unison, their voices overlapping. Money. They wanted money. $500,000 would solve all their problems, would let them pay off their debts and get an apartment and start over. They talked about it like it was simple math, like my bank account was just sitting there waiting to solve their crisis. My father added that it was the least I could do after everything they'd done for me, after raising me and putting up with my attitude all those years. My mother nodded along, still crying, still playing the victim. Maya just stared at me with this desperate, angry look, like she couldn't believe I was making them beg. The mediator turned to me and I took a deep breath before answering. I told them I wanted acknowledgement of the harm they'd caused me. Real acknowledgement, not just excuses disguised as apologies. I wanted assurance they'd never contact me again unless I chose to reach out to them first. I wanted boundaries respected and my family, my real family with James and our kids, left in peace. The silence that followed felt heavy, pressing down on all of us, and I could see from their faces that we were miles apart from any kind of agreement. The mediator called for a break, and I followed Harmony into a small conference room down the hall. My hands were shaking as I sat down, the weight of everything pressing on my chest. Harmony closed the door and pulled her chair close to mine, her expression serious but kind. She reminded me that I didn't owe them anything. Not legally, and not morally either. Whatever I chose to offer should be because I wanted to, not because I felt obligated or guilty about their situation. She said my family had spent years making me feel responsible for their happiness, and that pattern was showing up again right now in this mediation. I nodded, trying to absorb her words even though part of me still felt like the scared kid who got bread while Maya got bacon. Harmony asked what I actually wanted to do, not what I thought I should do or what would make them stop hating me. I took a deep breath and told her I wanted to offer something small, enough to show I wasn't completely heartless but not enough to enable their dysfunction, or make them think I'd cave to pressure. She asked how much and I said $50,000 one time, with conditions attached. Harmony made notes and said we could make that work, that we'd need ironclad language about the no-contact provision and acknowledgement that this was a gift, not an obligation. We spent another 10 minutes planning exactly how to present the offer, and then we walked back into the mediation room. My family looked up when we entered, their faces showing different versions of hope and desperation. The mediator asked if I was ready to continue, and I said yes. I looked across the table at my parents and Maya, and I stated my offer clearly. I would give them $50,000 total, one time only, with specific conditions that had to be met. They must withdraw their lawsuit immediately and sign an agreement to never contact me again, unless I reached out to them first. They also had to acknowledge in writing that I didn't owe them anything beyond this voluntary gift, that this money was my choice and not a legal or moral obligation. My father's face turned red before I even finished talking. He exploded out of his chair, his voice getting loud as he called me vindictive and cruel for offering so little when I had so much. He said I was rubbing my wealth in their faces, that $50,000 was pocket change to someone living in my house and driving my cars. Maya joined in immediately, her voice sharp and angry as she said $50,000 wouldn't even cover her restitution payments to her former employer. She said I knew exactly how much she owed and I was deliberately offering less just to watch her suffer. My mother just cried, her shoulders shaking as tears ran down her face, and I recognized it now for what it was. The manipulation tactic she'd used my whole childhood whenever she wanted me to feel guilty for existing. I stayed calm even though my heart was pounding. I told them this was my only offer, take it or leave it. They could accept my terms, or we could proceed with the countersuit, which would cost them even more in legal fees and likely result in sanctions from the judge for filing a baseless claim. Their choice, but I wasn't negotiating or changing the amount. My father started to argue again, but their attorney put a hand on his arm and asked to speak with them privately. The mediator directed them to another conference room, and I watched them file out, my father's face still red with anger, Maya's expression resentful, my mother still crying into a tissue. Harmony squeezed my hand under the table and told me I was doing great, that holding firm was exactly the right move. We sat in silence for 20 minutes, and I tried not to imagine what they were saying in that other room, whether they were cursing me or finally facing reality. When they came back, my father wouldn't look at me at all. Maya looked resentful, her jaw tight and her eyes hard. My mother was still crying, but she nodded when their attorney said they would accept my terms. The attorney looked tired, like he knew his clients were making the best of a terrible situation they'd created for themselves. We spent the next hour working out the exact language of the agreement, with both attorneys going back and forth on specific phrases. Every detail mattered, and Harmony was careful about each word. The no-contact provision specified that they couldn't call, text, email, visit, or contact me through third parties. The acknowledgement stated clearly that the $50,000 was a gift, not a legal obligation or admission of any duty to support them. The clause about disparaging me to others meant they couldn't trash-talk me to relatives, friends, or on social media without violating the agreement. My father huffed and complained about the restrictions, but their attorney kept telling him this was the deal, and he needed to accept it, or walk away with nothing. Maya stared at the table the whole time, picking at her fingernails until they looked raw. My mother kept wiping her eyes, but I noticed the tears had mostly stopped now that they were getting money. The mediator made sure everyone understood each provision, asking questions to confirm comprehension, and finally both attorneys said the language was acceptable. Everyone signed the agreement, 4 copies total, so each party and each attorney had one. My hand was steady as I wrote my signature on each page, initialing the margins where required. Then I pulled out my checkbook from my purse and wrote a check for $50,000 from my personal account, the one James had helped me build with his generous allowances over the years. I dated it and signed it carefully, then handed it to Harmony. She explained to everyone that she would hold it in escrow until their lawsuit was formally withdrawn and all paperwork was filed with the court. Once the judge signed off on the dismissal, she would release the check to their attorney. My father grumbled that he wanted the money now, but their attorney told him that's not how escrow works, and he needed to be patient. The mediator thanked everyone for their cooperation and said she hoped this resolution would bring peace to the family. I almost laughed at that, but I kept my expression neutral. As we were leaving the mediation office, Maya caught me in the hallway while everyone else was gathering their things. She stepped close and whispered that she hoped I could live with myself, abandoning my family when they needed me most. Her breath smelled stale, and I could see how thin she'd gotten, her clothes hanging loose on her frame. I looked her right in the eyes and told her I wasn't abandoning them. I was protecting myself from people who never treated me like family, who kicked me out at 18 and laughed at my husband and only called when they wanted money. She flinched like I'd slapped her, but she didn't say anything else, just turned and walked away down the hall. I watched her go, her shoulders hunched and her steps slow, and I felt something like pity mixed with relief that I'd never have to do this again. My mother tried one last guilt trip as we reached the elevator. She touched my arm gently and said she was sorry things turned out this way, that she wished we could have a real relationship like mothers and daughters should. Her voice was soft and sad, the same tone she used to use when she wanted me to apologize for something Maya had done. I pulled my arm away and told her she had 18 years to build a real relationship with me, and chose not to. This outcome was the consequence of her choices, not mine. She started crying again, but I stepped into the elevator with Harmony and let the doors close. Through the narrowing gap, I could see my mother's face crumple, but I didn't feel the guilt I expected. I just felt tired and ready to go home. My father didn't say anything at all during the whole goodbye process. He just stood near the exit door and glared at me with pure hatred in his eyes. I met his gaze and realized something surprising. He would probably hate me forever, and I was okay with that. His approval had stopped mattering years ago, back when he kicked me out and told me I was wasting my potential. I'd built a good life without his approval, and I didn't need it now. Harmony and I walked to our cars, and she told me I'd handled everything perfectly, that she was proud of how I stood my ground. I thanked her and drove home, my hands steady on the wheel, feeling lighter than I had in weeks. 2 weeks dragged by while I checked my phone every few hours, waiting for Harmony to call with an update. When her name finally lit up my screen, I grabbed it so fast I almost dropped it. She told me the court had processed everything. Their lawsuit was officially withdrawn, our countersuit was dismissed, and the agreement was filed with the county clerk. The check had been released from escrow that morning. It was done. I thanked her and hung up, then sat on the couch staring at nothing while my hands shook. James found me there 20 minutes later and asked if I was okay. I told him I didn't know how to feel. That part of me kept thinking I should have given them more money, that $50,000 wasn't enough to really help them start over. He sat down next to me and reminded me they'd spent years treating me like garbage, kicked me out as a teenager, and only came back when they needed something. I knew he was right, but the guilt sat in my chest like a rock anyway. I called Reagan that afternoon and asked for an emergency session. She fit me in the next morning, and I spent the whole hour talking about how wrong it felt to have money while my family struggled, even though they'd been cruel to me my whole life. She listened without interrupting, then asked me a question that made my brain stop working for a second. She wanted to know if I would have felt guilty refusing to help a stranger who treated me the same way my family had. I opened my mouth to answer and realized I wouldn't, that I'd tell a stranger to leave me alone without a second thought. Reagan nodded and explained that my family had programmed me to feel responsible for their problems, that they'd spent my whole childhood making me believe I owed them something just for existing. She said setting boundaries with toxic people wasn't cruel, it was healthy, and giving them $50,000 was more generous than they deserved given their behavior. I left her office feeling lighter, like someone had lifted a weight off my shoulders that I'd been carrying, so long I forgot it was there. That night, James and I put the kids to bed and sat in the kitchen talking about whether we should tell them what happened. Our daughter was 7 and our son was 5, old enough to notice things but too young to understand complicated family stuff. James thought we should wait until they were teenagers, but I worried they'd feel betrayed if we kept secrets. We went back and forth for an hour before deciding on a middle path. We'd wait until they were older to explain the whole story, but if they asked questions about my parents or why we never visited Grandma and Grandpa, we'd give them honest, simple answers that fit their age. No lies, but no trauma dumping on little kids either. James squeezed my hand and said we'd figure it out together, that we had years to plan the right words. I felt grateful all over again that I'd married someone who actually listened to me and treated my feelings like they mattered. 3 months went by without a single call, text, or letter from my family. At first, I jumped every time my phone rang, sure it would be Maya or my mother finding some loophole in the agreement. But as weeks turned into months, I started to relax. I'd wake up in the morning and realize I hadn't thought about them the day before, that whole hours were passing where they didn't cross my mind at all. The anxiety I'd been carrying since that first phone call from Maya started to fade, and I noticed I was sleeping better, laughing more with the kids, enjoying little moments instead of waiting for the next crisis. One morning, I was making breakfast and caught myself humming while I flipped pancakes, and it hit me that I felt genuinely peaceful for the first time in months. The legal agreement meant they couldn't harass me anymore, and knowing that made everything feel safer somehow. I kept seeing Reagan every other week, working through all the childhood stuff I'd buried for years. We talked about how my parents gave Maya the good food while I got scraps, how they locked me in my room to study while she went on field trips, how every wall in that house celebrated her achievements while mine went in the trash. Reagan helped me see patterns I'd never noticed before, like how I always apologized first in arguments even when I wasn't wrong, or how I struggled to ask for things I needed because I'd learned early that my needs didn't matter. She explained that children who grow up in homes where love is conditional learn to twist themselves into shapes that please others, and it takes years of work to untangle that programming. Some sessions left me crying so hard I could barely drive home, but other times I felt angry in a way that was actually healthy, like I was finally letting myself feel mad about things that deserved anger. Reagan said the goal wasn't to stop having feelings about my family, it was to stop letting those feelings control my choices. She reminded me that my family's problems weren't my fault, That I didn't cause their financial mess or Maya's gambling addiction, and protecting myself and my kids from their chaos was the right thing to do. 6 months after the mediation, an email popped up in my inbox from an address I didn't recognize. My stomach dropped when I opened it and saw it was from Maya's attorney. The message was short and polite, asking if I'd be willing to help Maya find employment given her difficulty securing interviews with her criminal record. I stared at the screen, feeling my heart race, then forwarded it to Harmony without responding. She called me an hour later sounding annoyed and told me she'd handle it. The next day, she sent their attorney a formal letter reminding him that any contact from my family, direct or indirect, violated our agreement and would result in immediate legal action. She copied me on the email, and I read her words feeling both relieved and sad. Part of me wanted to help Maya find a job because I knew how hard it must be with an embezzlement conviction, but I also knew that any contact would open a door I'd worked hard to close. Harmony was right to shut it down. Maya never tried again after that. My birthday came around in December, and I was outside decorating the porch with lights when the mail truck pulled up. The driver handed me a stack of envelopes, and right on top was a card with my mother's handwriting on it. My hands started shaking as I stared at it, recognizing her loopy cursive from years of seeing it on Maya's birthday cards and report cards while mine went unsigned. I brought it inside and called Harmony before I even opened it. She told me not to open it at all, that any contact violated the agreement and we needed to document it. I took photos of the envelope and sent them to her, then stuck the card in a drawer unopened. 2 days later, Harmony mailed my mother's attorney a cease and desist letter with copies of the agreement highlighting the no contact clause. She told them this was their only warning and any future violations would result in us seeking enforcement through the court. I never got another card after that, and I felt relieved more than anything else. My mother's attempt at reaching out felt like manipulation, not genuine love, and I was glad Harmony had stopped it before it could mess with my head. A year passed after the mediation, and I woke up one morning realizing something had changed. I'd been having these awful dreams for months where my family showed up at my door demanding money, or where I was a kid again getting locked in my room while Maya ate dinner downstairs. But I couldn't remember the last time I'd had one of those dreams. I lay in bed thinking back through the past few weeks and realized my sleep had been peaceful, that I'd stopped waking up with my heart racing and my sheets soaked with sweat. The therapy had actually worked. I'd processed all that childhood trauma and genuinely moved past it, not by forgetting what happened, but by accepting it and choosing not to let it control me anymore. I didn't need my parents' approval, and I wasn't afraid of their judgment because their opinions had stopped mattering. That realization felt huge, like I'd finally closed a chapter that had been open my whole life. James surprised me that spring with tickets to Hawaii for the whole family. We spent a week on Maui, building sandcastles with the kids, snorkeling in crystal clear water, eating fresh pineapple that tasted like sunshine. I was lying on the beach watching our son chase waves when I realized I hadn't thought about my parents or Maya once since we'd landed. Not once. I was completely present with my real family, the one I'd chosen and built, and it felt like the purest kind of freedom. James noticed me smiling and asked what I was thinking about. I told him I was thinking about nothing except how lucky I was to be there with him and our kids, and he kissed me and said he felt the same way. That night after the kids fell asleep, we sat on our hotel balcony listening to the ocean and talking about how far we'd come since that awful day when my family showed up demanding money. We'd protected our peace, set healthy boundaries, and created a life full of love and stability. I felt proud of us for handling everything the right way. The message came through Harmony's office on a Tuesday afternoon in late summer. My father had died of a heart attack 2 days earlier, and his attorney was informing me as required by our agreement. They weren't asking for anything, just letting me know. I sat in my car in the grocery store parking lot reading Harmony's email over and over, waiting to feel something big. But what came was just a quiet sadness, not the crushing grief I might have expected. I realized I'd already grieved for my father years ago, back when I was 18, and he kicked me out for not being the daughter he wanted. I'd mourned the father I never had, the one who might have loved me and supported me and been proud of my accomplishments. The man who died was a stranger who happened to share my DNA, someone who'd made his choices and lived with them. I felt sad that he'd died angry at me, that we'd never had a real relationship, but I didn't feel devastated. I called James and told him the news, and he asked if I wanted to go to the funeral. I thought about it for maybe 30 seconds before saying no, that I'd send flowers, but I wouldn't attend. He said that was completely reasonable, and he supported whatever I decided. I ordered a flower arrangement through an online service the next day, something simple and respectful. The florist asked if I wanted to include a card, and I typed out a brief message expressing condolences without claiming feelings I didn't have. When the delivery confirmation came through, I felt relieved that I'd acknowledged his death without compromising the boundaries I'd worked so hard to build. James asked if I was okay, and I told him honestly that I felt sad, but not devastated, that I'd already done my grieving years ago when I was accepted that the father I wanted would never exist. He squeezed my hand and said he understood, that grief didn't follow a script and I didn't owe anyone a performance. That conversation helped me realize I'd made the right choice, that protecting my peace wasn't cold or cruel, it was just honest. The funeral happened without me and nobody contacted me about it, which told me they understood the boundaries were real and permanent. 2 years slipped by faster than I expected. I joined a book club through our community center and made actual friends, women who knew me as myself and not as anyone's daughter or sister. I started volunteering at the local food bank on Saturday mornings, packing boxes and organizing donations, finding satisfaction in helping people without the complicated history that came with my own family. Our house became the place where neighborhood kids gathered after school, our kitchen always full of snacks and laughter. I hosted dinner parties where James and I cooked together while our friends sat around the island drinking wine and telling stories. I took a pottery class and discovered I loved working with clay, the quiet focus it required and the tangible results. My instructor said I had natural talent and encouraged me to enter a piece in the local art fair. I did, and it sold within an hour of the fair opening. That small success felt bigger than it should have because it was mine, something I'd created with my own hands and my own effort. I wasn't anyone's disappointment or anyone's trophy wife. I was just me, building a life filled with people who valued me for who I actually was. Our kids grew taller and more confident every day. They brought home good grades and stories about friends and complaints about homework that sounded so normal and healthy. I watched them navigate small disappointments without falling apart, saw them celebrate each other's successes without jealousy. James coached our son's soccer team and attended every one of our daughter's piano recitals, cheering louder than any other parent. He helped with homework at the kitchen table and read bedtime stories in different voices that made the kids giggle. When our daughter scraped her knee learning to ride her bike, James cleaned the wound gently while explaining how skin heals itself, turning a scary moment into a science lesson. Our son came home upset about a friend excluding him from a game, and James sat with him for an hour talking about feelings and friendship and how to handle conflict. I watched these interactions and felt something shift inside me, like an old wound finally closing. This was what family looked like when it worked right, when parents showed up and supported and loved without conditions or comparisons. My kids would never know what it felt like to be the disappointment, to eat stale bread while someone else got a full breakfast, to have their achievements thrown in the trash. They were growing up secure and loved, and that healed parts of me I didn't even know were still broken. Sometimes late at night when the house was quiet, I wondered about Maya and my mother. I imagined different scenarios, some where they'd found stability and some where they were still struggling. Part of me wanted to know if they were okay, if the money I'd given them had helped or if they'd blown through it quickly. But I never broke the agreement to find out. I'd learned through therapy and time that protecting my peace wasn't selfish, that I couldn't set myself on fire to keep other people warm. My peace was the foundation for everything good in my life, the stable ground that let me be a good wife and mother and friend. Without it, I had nothing to give anyone. So I kept the boundaries firm and focused on the family I'd chosen, the life I'd built brick by brick from nothing. James and the kids, my friends, my volunteer work, my pottery, the warm kitchen full of laughter. This was my real family now. I was happy in a way I'd never imagined possible back when I was 18, and scared and convinced I'd never amount to anything. I'd built something beautiful from the ashes of that old life, and I wasn't going back, not ever.